This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
So up until this point, we've been covering sort of these serial killers in Louisiana from a different time. And, you know, one of the reasons I started hunting the idea of Clay in the very first place was because I had an interest in a case that when I first came to know it, it was called the Jennings 8. But it's gotten more popular over the last couple of years, and it's been referenced as being called the Jeff Davis 8. And the Jeff Davis 8, we've sort of talked about off and on through the course of just talking about serial killers in Louisiana. What was fascinating to me was digging into these cases, because this is like, it's not one case, it's like multiple cases. And I had heard different things about this. I've always been big into cases in Louisiana and Alabama because I have family from that area. And I personally, I had a big, I guess it's now a true crime thing. It wasn't at the time. I didn't know it was going to be. I had a big case that I did a lot of work on in Louisiana, not in this area. It was down in New Orleans, which is a ways away. But I had a close friend for many years and an employer as well. They were both from Louisiana. And what struck me about this case is this is right up your alley in terms of victims. You're very into the victims that could easily be forgotten.
I am, but it's funny because this case is actually, it's widened my perspective on that a little bit.
I'm curious why it would widen your perspective on that.
So I realized something. It really ticks me off that whenever anybody is treated as a disposable person, and then when someone who is considered to be disposable by whomever, right? Whoever thinks that gives the impression someone is disposable. And then when somebody who is considered to be disposable becomes a victim, and then you can tell law enforcement is treating them that way, that's really irritating to me. But then there's this other side of it. And I can imagine after years and years and years of dealing with it, I've always sort of had this impression, but with this particular set of cases, it became very apparent to me that it was almost like they didn't want any culpability to be put on some of these victims. And that bothered me too, because there was a comment made on something that had to do with one of these cases, or perhaps more than one of these cases. Actually, several comments have been made about if it had been the good little girl walking down the road who was killed, or if it had been a girl from the other side of the tracks. Apparently that's a thing there, that they've actually got train tracks that separate it's like not just in the figurative sense, like they actually have a divide. But now I'm not saying that being poor is a reason for somebody to be, somebody that's disposable or a victim that, everyone else can just disregard. But there's a reason, and this probably sounds really hypocritical, but there's a reason that the good girl walking down the street didn't get killed.
Okay, so first of all, let me clarify what you mean by the words culpability. Are you saying that the culpability of the perpetrators, like people don't want to take responsibility for having been involved in whatever's happening here?
No, I'm saying now I'm not saying anybody deserves to die, and especially not die and be dumped in a, where you're not going to be found for a while and you're going to decompose. I'm not saying anybody deserves that. The issue I have is that it's sort of like the chances you take in life, right? The life you decide to live, to a certain extent, you've got to own it. And sometimes when you're in situations where you are dealing with people who are more apt to get mad and snap, you're exposing yourself to that.
Right.
Okay.
I understand what you're saying about the decision-making part of these people's lives.
It's just, while I don't feel like they're disposable, I also feel like it's a very good, I don't know if the people who are making these comments truly believe what they're saying, or because in that case, I feel bad. Like they need to realize that, oh, well, the reason that this happened, it did have to do with the lifestyle they lived because they were around people who were capable of doing this to them.
Right. And so I think that big difference for me here, and I've gone in pretty deep dives on a number of high risk victim, what appear to be serial crimes, possibly serial murders. I think that the difference here is sort of the geography of it all. And for people that aren't super familiar with Louisiana doesn't have counties, they have parishes. And we've been talking about that a little bit as we go, but this particular area that all of this is happening in is known as Jefferson Davis or Jeff Davis Parish. And the seat, the county seat, the parish seat, ever how you want to say it, is Jennings, Louisiana. Now, in the parish itself, as of today, there are around 32,000 people. That's the whole parish. That's the entire county. In Jennings proper, there are the population there actually declines over the years. So if you look at it in 2010 to 2014, they had a population of under 13,000 people. And now the current estimated population there is under 9,000 people. So it's actually going down. This is in the Lake Charles area of Louisiana. It's an area that's 68% Caucasian, white. And what drew me to looking at this overall, as opposed to other, I would say, high-risk homicide cases that involve like multiple victims of very similar circumstances, is the geography of it and the fact that demographically, it's a really small place. It defies what's happened here. It defies the sort of running homicide average for the entire nation. And like you could get into some really big cities and that number would be competitive, but
any sort of like suburbia type town that had 8 unsolved homicides, it would be quite alarming.
Right. And so that's where I started right there. And
It
that's
doesn't even matter what type of person they were at all.
No, it doesn't. But what baffled me is this area is largely focused on by a writer from New Orleans named Ethan Brown. And Ethan Brown, without Ethan Brown, this case sort of gets brushed away. His work has resulted in multiple articles and writings, and if you dig into it, it's also the source for a lot of documentary work that is covering the case. And the crazy part is there are way more cases than just the Jeff Davis 8, which doesn't help it. It makes it even worse.
Well, one of the things I realized was Ethan Brown did a very thorough investigation. In fact, it's one of the most thorough investigative reports, and I say that collectively with regard to like everything that's come from the work he did. It's very thorough, and still nothing has happened.
Yeah, that was the fascinating part for me. Like, thorough is a good word. This is almost I'm reached out to him because I want to see if we can talk to him at some point. I don't know if that's going to happen or not because he's gotten a lot of notoriety recently, but he is responsible for what I would call a long form essay on this, and then a book, and then a follow up to all of that. This case has been his obsession. And when you say thorough, like, it's funny because there was a certain part in here. I looked at the long form piece, which is the original thing I read about this case. And that is more like my speed and how I operate. Like, he did a lot of the work that I do, but he took it a step further. And when the book came out, and then there's now a follow-up, which has even, more investigative work, he did some stuff. Like, I usually find like one thing about a case that like nobody else has really looked at. But he pulls a couple of threads in the course of all of this that absolutely blew my mind. And I say that from the perspective of like he dug into property records and made some connections to some real power in several places in Louisiana that I would not have thought of. And he did it based on the fact that he was able to see that there were essentially some geography involved. Specifically, there's this place called the Boudreaux Inn. The Boudreaux Inn's ownership plays into his theory. But so he starts looking into this basically as the Jeff Davis 8 is coming to a close, I guess you could say. It's a multi-year investigation, and he becomes the primary source. No matter how you want to shake it, he is the primary source. His work is the primary source. So I want to make sure that he gets all of the credit for anything that we're saying here. The idea that he had was, in looking at the Jeff Davis 8, from 2005 to 2009, 8 women were murdered in this part of Southwest Louisiana. And he wanted to know why a federal, state, and local task force was pursuing the theory that this was a serial killer. These killings remain unsolved, like at least as far as court is concerned. But the idea behind this case is that something far more sinister than just a serial killer is going on. So the bodies of the 8 women were found in swamps and canals that surrounded a town called Jennings, Louisiana, that, as I said, has a very, very small population. Most people in a town like that, they know each other. The bodies were found in advanced stages of decomposition, and the cause of death in each case, in several of the cases, was almost impossible to determine. It kicks off with a woman named Loretta Chasson, or Loretta Lewis, depending on how you look at her on paper. She had been married to a gentleman named Lewis, so that was technically her last name. She was found floating in a river by a fisherman on May 20th of 2005. They estimated her death was several days earlier, on May 17th, 2005. We were talking about like high risk women. But the case of the Jeff Davis 8 is not actually limited to women. The Jeff Davis 8 is the moniker that's been given to the case. And that part, yes, the 8 are all women. But even though she's found in 2005, problems in this area, in the Jeff Davis parish, in the county itself, they run back to the early 90s. And they had caught national attention from Dateline as of 1997, which is funny because that ties into the Howard Stern phone call that kicked off us going down this. This is not even a rabbit hole at this point. This is a rat hole. It has no end. It's a bottomless pit.
It's bad.
Right.
Really, really bad.
Right. So Dateline ran an hour-long expose on the sheriff's deputies in the Jeff Davis parish, but they also included a nearby parish, which is called Calcasieu. I don't know how you pronounce it. It's Calcasieu. And then I'm going to go ahead and warn everybody, the names in this get crazy.
Calcasieu, I believe.
Calcasieu?
Okay, right?
So that sounds better than what I said. But essentially, the names in this case are largely based on like
Cajun French.
It was what would be known as Cajun French.
For example, the last name Richard is Richard.
Yeah,
and
Richard.
I'm like, no, that says Richard, but they insist it's Richard, right?
So what Dateline did was they basically confronted the sheriff at the time, a guy named Sheriff Edwards, who's in the middle of all of this, on whether or not he was targeting out-of-state people for illegal traffic stops.
And this was after Dateline had received what was referred to as like copious or numerous complaints.
Right. There's a documentation
from I guess their viewership, their audience members said, we're getting unfairly treated here.
Yeah, it's funny because if you go through and like read the news articles from the time, Kathleen Blanco, who was the lieutenant governor when it happened, she noted that this expose was estimated to have been watched by around 12.8 million households.
It was huge because it was probably one of the first So Dateline's an investigative journalism program. And it was one of the first well-documented exposures of corruption.
No, basically. It is an expose. Was that what you're going to say? It's totally an expose of this. It's crazy.
Is that what the word is? Expose?
It would be an expose, yeah.
But it's one of the very first that was, because they had hidden cameras and they had these documented complaints, and they went in the camera, and it was actually, if you watch it, it's a little bit astounding to see because they went in undercover, and then exactly what everybody said was happening happened to them.
Yes, it did. And I just found it fascinating because the lieutenant governor basically blamed the negative publicity, which is generated by the Dateline show, for costing the state $150 million in estimated tourism revenue. And I looked at that and I was like, these people, okay, so
they're clueless.
The way that you fix that is you take responsibility for the people that you're.
Okay, well, what was happening was there was a law written, and it was a state law, I believe. If not, it's the interpretation of a federal law. But it allowed for law enforcement to seize any property, which would include like currency, money, that they believed to be involved in any sort of drug activity. And so what ended up happening was, like, on the spot, they could take it from you. But in order to get it back, you had to have been, so even without being charged, okay, like you could literally be pulled over and they could say, we think you're involved in drugs, give us all your money. And they were robbing people blind with absolutely no, like, they didn't think any of these people were involved in drugs. It's just all they had to do was say, well, I suspected that money was involved in drugs, so I was allowed to take it. And it went really, really deep and dirty because the money, like 60% of the proceeds seized went to the law enforcement department who got it.
Right.
The other part went to the district attorney's office, and then like this last little part went to a judicial fund.
Right, and that's what I was actually going to say. So there's a law enforcement bulletin that's circulated this bulletin is from February of 1997, and here's what it says. It outlines everything that you're talking about. It says that Louisiana law enforcement stops innocent motorists and seizes their property from an NBC Dateline report. The 45-minute program focused on cases in which motorists were stopped, arrested, and had their property seized without evidence of drugs in their car. The program said that most of the misconduct occurred along Interstate 10 and Jefferson Davis, and it says Cameron Parish, but I'd have to look into that, but I'm just reading the law enforcement bulletin at this point. In southwestern Louisiana, that out-of-state travelers, particularly minorities, were usually targeted. Hidden cameras were used to record searches and seizures showing police officers stopping the TV crew for, quote, violations they did not commit and asking crew members how much money they had. Dateline reporter John Larson spent more than a year researching abuses of the state's drug forfeiture law. Under state law, to sue for a return of their seized assets, uncharged citizens must pay the highest bond in the nation, which is 10% of the property's value, or $2,500, whichever is greater. The burden of proving the innocence is completely on the citizens. Baton Rouge defense attorney Jim Boren, who claims that drug forfeiture corruption is statewide, said that district attorneys' offices sometimes offer to return half or a third of the value of the property seized to settle the claims. The distribution of the seized assets, which is what you were referencing, also came under fire in the NBC program. In Louisiana, 60% of seizure proceeds go to the law enforcement agency that seized the property, 20% goes to the district attorney, and the remaining 20% goes to the state judge's judicial expense fund. There is a classic conflict of interest, said U.S. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Henry Hyde, who was at the time the Republican from Illinois, because the judges who determined if the seizure was made legally received the money. Boren said that law enforcement officials sometimes use the money for reasons other than improving drug law enforcement, citing a case in which a district attorney used seized funds to buy an aquarium for his office. Soon after the Dateline broadcast, which was estimated to be watched by 12.7 million households, it's a little different than what I thought, but it's close, finished in the top 10 of primetime television shows for that week, state and local tourism bureaus began receiving calls from people threatening to cancel trips and conventions. Louisiana obtains a high proportion of its income from tourism, including the Super Bowl in late January and Mardi Gras in February. Lieutenant Governor Kathleen Blanco, head of the state's tourism office, estimated the show could cost Louisiana $150 million. The Louisiana House Criminal Justice Committee discussed the report shortly after its broadcast. If a quarter of this is true, it's really disturbing, said committee chairman Steve Windhurst. David Laverne, an attorney for the House committee, told news briefs that there was a good chance that bills changing the forfeiture law would be introduced in the upcoming legislative session that begins in March, but that all bills are confidential until they are pre-filed. None had been pre-filed by February the 5th, which is the date of this bulletin. Laverne said the committee would probably hold another discussion of the allegations after they receive a legislative auditor's report that is re-examining the charges and determining how the forfeiture model is being used. Louisiana Governor, who at the time was Mike Foster, is open to looking at changes in the law as long as they don't undermine the actual law enforcement, said Marson Goolsby, who was the governor's press secretary. And Pete Adams, the executive director of the Louisiana District Attorneys Association, also supports minor changes to the law to correct alleged abuses. The drug forfeiture law was approved by voters in 1989 as a constitutional amendment, and it was opposed at the time by Baton Rouge's daily newspaper, The Morning Advocate. In an editorial on January 11th of 1997, The Morning Advocate said that the Dateline program showed the abuses are encouraged by a system that anoints law enforcers with too much power and rewards them for stretching those powers. The paper also criticized state officials' calls for reform as tame because they allow motorists to be shaken down without evidence of a crime and require citizens to prove they deserve their own property back. In addition, the paper said the system tempts prosecutors to go easy on real drug lords by making deals to keep seized cars or drug money in exchange for dropping charges and letting the criminal walk. So
there's something I want to mention. In there, you said that the lieutenant governor
and the governor, yeah.
Okay, so she said that the show was going to cost the state $160 million in forfeited tourism revenue. Potentially, right? Because the show exposed the behavior. The true statement there is
we've cost ourselves $150 million through these corrupt officers.
Law enforcement decisions that are being carried out on our highway being exposed by Dateline is going to cost us. And that is a really good sort of sentiment to a lot of what I've seen looking into some of these cases. They happen to be in Louisiana. It doesn't mean that's the only place it happens. But that was not Dateline's fault at all, because they could have gone undercover and found nothing if nobody had been doing the wrong thing.
Right. And so it has, it has gotten some minor modifications. Prosecutors are now required in Louisiana to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the property at stake is connected to a crime. And ultimately, the problem there is it still falls on the innocent owner. Like third-party owners have to prove their own innocence, but the distribution is still the same as before. 60% goes to the seizing agencies, 20% to the prosecuting district attorney's offices, and 20% to the criminal court fund. So before we go any further, I want to ask you, what do you feel about, how much do you think is seized every year in civil asset forfeiture, which is what we're dealing with here? This is civil asset
in Louisiana?
Anywhere in the U.S.?
Way too much.
If you had to put a number on it and just guess,
well, I mean, in the entire United States, $2 billion.
It is way more than that now. It is so right now. And
I said billion with a B.
Yeah, it is way more than that. It is estimated to be around $5 billion per year
in civil asset forfeiture,
right?
Which goes to law enforcement.
Yeah. So the history of that is in 1986, $93.7 million was seized according to federal numbers. In 2004, there was $567 million. In 2005, there was $1.25 billion. In 2007, it was about $1.6 billion. In 2008, the same, around $1.6 billion. And in 2010, it was estimated to be over $2.5 billion. And then in 2013, they reported $4 billion. And then the numbers start getting murky.
Where's that from?
This is going to come out of the reporting of the DOJ's asset forfeiture fund. Do you want to see it?
No, I was just curious what you were reading from.
Forbes regularly, I'm reading from Forbes at the moment. This regularly, they end up as the source for the wiki on this, the DOJ's asset forfeiture fund articles.
Yeah, it should scare the crap out of everybody.
It really should. So this 12-year period that Forbes looked at, agencies took over $20 billion in cash, securities, and property from drug bosses, Wall Street tycoons, and ordinary Americans who had committed no crimes. One estimate was that in 85% of civil forfeiture instances, the property owner was never even charged with a crime. In 2010, there were 11,000 non-criminal forfeiture cases, and in 2020, claimants challenged 1,800 civil forfeiture seizures in federal court. Now, this is largely what I'm reading means it's gotten to the point that it's been reported to the DOJ, which means that it's probably about half to three quarters of what's really going on, because a lot of these local places are not.
I think they just put it in their pocket.
Yeah, and I want to point out what I'm talking about here, because it plays into some of what we're doing with the Jeff Davis 8. Jeff Davis 8's very focused, and this episode I'm talking broadly. This is civil asset forfeiture. So in order, for people to really understand what I'm saying, when you hear those words, what do you think, Meg?
Civil asset forfeiture?
Yeah.
It's, well, I'm not really sure how it differs from criminal asset forfeiture, but because it still has to do with criminal charges, but it means basically you've used something illegally and they're taking it from you.
Yeah, so civil forfeiture, the key word is a suspicion. So with criminal forfeiture, like I just want
the difference. Wow. It's not even a thing for me. That doesn't even register.
I want to make sure that people understand what I'm saying, because I think people hear these words and they think, like, I honestly think that people think that this means someone was charged and found guilty and like forfeited
that
something.
That is not the case.
That's not what that's happening. In some cases, the people involved it's not even that they're not charged. They're not even connected.
Right. It's like if you're driving down the highway and you get pulled over and like what happened with the Dateline, they say, how much money do you have? And you say, a couple $100. They're like, give it to me. And you hand it over. You just don't want to be arrested right there. And they take it.
Yeah, and so here's where it gets interesting for me. I don't know that type thing is reported so much.
I think they just put that in their pocket.
I think that goes like into a local situation. So that should scare people that $2 billion I'm talking about could be $3 billion. That's a huge number. Like if you were to take $1 million and you stacked it as $1 bills and you laid it down, it's 120 yards long. But if you took and I can't remember who told me this recently, but I looked it up and it was correct. If you took $1 billion $1 bills as opposed to that 120 yards, which is like the length of a football field and then some, how far do you think that stretches? The $1 billion $1 bills stacked and then laid on its side.
I don't think that way. I have no idea.
68 miles. As opposed to a football field, it goes 68 miles. That's the difference, like, in how big these numbers are. And,
it's a lot.
and like you were describing, people can kind of like pull you over and say what's in your pocket. What makes it interesting is that a lot of the people involved weren't involved in the original crime. And that is, say I'm driving your car and I'm pulled over and they tell me they're taking my car.
But it's your car, right?
But you're the one who has to put up the bond to get the property back and prove on the preponderance of the evidence that you weren't involved in the crime.
Right.
It has nothing to do with me. Same thing with houses. They would take houses.
You don't necessarily have to have committed a crime to begin with.
Exactly.
It's just the suspicion of the crime.
Exactly. So
it is bullying is what this is.
Right.
Straight up.
With criminal forfeiture, there's 5 main elements. And the first is that it's the state against a person or persons. The Latin term would be in personam, meaning it would be like very specific. So this is criminal forfeiture. The legal test to proceed with criminal forfeiture is that it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. And the third step is a court cannot do this. Like the court itself cannot do this. How does that work exactly?
I don't know. I haven't gone this deep on this.
Well, so assets returned if a prosecution doesn't prove the guilt in its criminal forfeiture. And then there's multiple examples that you can go find. One of them was the United States versus John Doe. That was an interesting case. And I'll send you some of this as we go along, because this is sort of how this all wraps up for me. And then we'll go back to Jeff Davison 8. Civil forfeiture, police are actually filing, if they file it, if they do the right thing, against a thing. So with criminal, it's against the person. Police, it's against the thing. The legal test in this case is a preponderance of the evidence, which is pretty loosey-goosey when it comes to cops, which means the idea of preponderance of the evidence is basically that the burden of persuasion or proof, one party can be assumed to be correct.
It's more so than not.
Right. And with a civil forfeiture, a court can take into account the decision of a defendant to take the fifth, meaning they don't want to incriminate themselves. In criminal forfeiture, the court cannot take into account the decision of pleading the fifth. So you're protected if it's criminal. You're not protected if it's civil. And if you prove your innocence, then the assets are returned to you. Now, here's where it gets crazy. So the Justice Department, the department that is the highest law in our little land, they have three main justifications for civil forfeiture. What would you guess that they were?
Suspicion of a crime?
No. These are justifications, like why we can do this. So the three main justifications for why the Justice Department can do this. What would you suspect that those three things were?
Justification for why law enforcement can take stuff?
Yeah.
Well, because you shouldn't profit from crime.
So would you call that deterrence or punishment?
Well, it would be both.
Okay,
it would be like saying, it'd be like, go get a real job.
Yeah, so that's the first justification they say is the main thing. Punishment and deterrence. To punish and deter criminal activity by depriving them of property that was used or acquired through illegal activity. That's the main thing that the Justice Department says civil asset forfeiture does.
Well, wouldn't that be... Okay, go ahead.
No, I'm with you. So they're basically...
that could just be criminal asset forfeiture.
Well, they're saying they need the civil asset forfeiture because they can't always make their cases because our system it's clogged and they don't trust it, which is ironic since they're the ones... And I would have to say, it appears to me like quite a bit of clogging is done through this as opposed to... Absolutely.
Resolving it, yeah.
This creates a problem in our court system. The second part of this is they want to enhance police cooperation. So it enhances cooperation among foreign, federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies through the equitable sharing of assets recovered through this program. If we did that as people, what is that called? Like if you and I decided, you know what, these banks are getting greedy. We're going to go take a little bit of what they got going on, and I'm going to get a guy at the bank to help me take it, and then I'm going to get
racketeering.
Yeah. This is basically the Justice Department being involved in racketeering. That's what this is. They're so enhancing police cooperation or whatever you call it, legal racketeering. That's the second reason. The third main justification for civil asset forfeiture is revenue for law enforcement as a byproduct. To produce revenues, to enhance forfeitures, and to strengthen law enforcement.
Okay, revenue from law enforcement is always a bad idea.
Yeah, that's a terrible idea. Revenue for law enforcement, meaning they're essentially, this is where quotas come in for people. People think of quotas. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
Right, you've got to hit a certain number.
Yeah, and so the idea behind this is... it's problematic because what happens when the people in power have all of the power and it's stacked against the people that they're going after? There is corruption, right?
Right.
Probably the weirdest form of asset forfeiture for me is a variant of civil asset forfeiture. It's called administrative forfeiture. Have you ever heard of this?
Probably.
This is civil asset forfeiture that does not require involvement by the courts. So it derives its power from the Tariff Act of 1930 and empowers police to seize certain merchandise, as well as things used to import or transport or possibly store controlled substances, money, or other property that has less than $500,000 in value individually. So what happens there is pretty much anything the average person owns doesn't actually have to go to the court. Like up through basically houses. So that is what you run into in Louisiana if you dig deep into this case. There's all sorts of reasons now. And this is civil asset forfeiture is not, a defunded thing. It is not a controlled thing. There have been some controls and contested measures attached to it. Overall, in most all 50 states, it is a giant problem.
I almost don't even want to talk about it because I don't want to give any of law enforcement that aren't aware of it. I don't want to give them any ideas.
Oh, they're very aware of it. That's
I don't think so. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of people who aren't.
You think
that,
law enforcement is not aware of civil asset
I'm
forfeiture?
not saying that. No, I'm not saying that all of them are not aware. I'm saying like it's unfortunate, but also human nature that people push the boundaries. And I don't think every cop knows about this.
Yeah, it is now ingrained in every department in the land. I have yet to run
Why
across
isn't
a
it more
police
rampant
agent.
then?
It is rampant.
But
It's just
more
not
rampant.
talked about. It is like billions of dollars rampant. I want to give you like some of the proponents just to tell you like what people are saying. And people, you can go look up different people. Douglas Leff is an FBI special agent that talks about it. There are Wikipedias on this. You can find this, and that's today. I'm going to pull from just a second because I want to talk about civil asset forfeiture, and I want specifically now to talk about proponents, meaning they're for it. They argue that like this is necessary to help police fight serious crimes. Basically, the core argument is this is for police to fight organizations who are doing something that is beyond the means of local departments. Essentially, like in my head, what I always think of is like drug cartels. So it's seen as a powerful weapon in continuing a battle against organizations that promote, distribute, and sell illegal drugs. The idea is that it's effective at discouraging criminal activity, which you would think, as long as they've been doing this, if it were going to discourage criminal activity, wouldn't the criminal activity have stopped? Because organized crime is alive and well in America.
Yeah, it's also there's a cycle.
Exactly. We've recognized this in like a number of things we've covered, even here, just in audio form. Civil asset forfeiture makes it easier for law enforcement to fight against organized crime organizations when they've had trouble imprisoning offenders.
Right, because basically if they're like, for example, you said the cartel, like in the drug industry, if money's not being made there, or if the money that's being made is taken out of your possession and you're not able to use it, you are not going to continue to sell drugs just because it's the right thing to do and you enjoy spending your time doing it.
Right. So what happens is that starts at the right place, right?
It does, yeah, but it just
prosecutors are able to do this so they could hobble a criminal organization with civil asset forfeiture. The problem is they then overreach and start taking individuals' property, and that
don't have anything to do with drug selling or criminal activity.
Yeah, it's not limited to drug selling. What they uncovered in Jennings, Louisiana, they aren't doing anything.
When you've just got people passing through and you're taking their pocket money, you've got a problem.
A huge problem. Yeah, your problem is that you don't have law enforcement. Does that make sense? You have people with the power of the badge, but they're not enforcing laws.
They're bullying people and they're stealing it. And it was caught on tape, and that the clips from that show are still available. And if you see it, it would make anybody's skin crawl. The way that the officers are acting, it's totally inappropriate. And this is from I don't know. It aired in 1997. I don't know if it was shot in 1997 or 1996, but it's appalling.
This is the behavior, so it's sort of interesting because I actually think being able to hobble criminal organizations, cartels and the like, would have a benefit to it. But what is going on is not that.
Right. And so what's the problem?
Well, the problem is over the years, including even now, and most recently where I've heard arguments about it, sort of officially, was 2008. The problem is the Department of Justice was able to say that civil forfeiture of cash from innocent people in thousands of traffic stops, they said they did a comparison and that they felt like a lot of people that were caught up in this were major drug money couriers. And that means that these people were simply carrying money. They didn't have drugs on them. They didn't have firearms. They weren't doing anything else illegal. They were simply shuffling thousands of dollars back and forth between where it came from and where it was headed to. That is what has long allowed them to keep doing this. And the descriptions that they have were hundreds of millions of dollars in the back of a pickup truck, and like all their dope is now sold. It's terrible because that is what has kept this in place so long. The critics of this, which is sort of the opposing side, they have a list as well, just like what we just talked about, it being effective in fighting organized crime. First up, most civil forfeitures are completely devoid of due process, according to critics, including the ACLU, even the Heritage Foundation, which I found it so weird that the ACLU and the Heritage Foundation, the ACLU being a very left-leaning political organization and the Heritage Foundation being a very conservative, right-leaning group, they agree on this. They believe that there's a flawed judicial process, literally suggesting that there's no due process clause, the due process clause of the Constitution. There's no way for owners to actually challenge the state, which ostensibly the state has much more resources than most individuals.
Absolutely. And law enforcement, in the act of doing it, they have everything on their side in that moment. Right.
The complex process to get back your money or your assets that you've lost is very expensive.
It is, and to have to put up a $2,500 bond or 10% if it's more than that, you have to do the one that's more. Okay, which is weird because normally it's whatever value is less. But anyway, it's not worth getting back $100 or whatever.
Right. So you don't really challenge that. If you're in a situation where you're being charged and like you have to prove in a court of law your own innocence, because that's the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing. The prosecution is supposed to be proving you're guilty. So if you're in a situation where you are, we'll say everything's going right and the prosecutor has to prove you guilty, the court, the justice system is required to give you a lawyer to help defend you. Like you have a right to a lawyer. In the case of the civil justice system and civil asset forfeiture, they are not required to give you any kind of attorney. And most victims in cases where there were actual innocence claims for these civil asset forfeitures were unable to fight the seizures by hiring a lawyer. So the other problem is, in the process of all of this, a lot of the documents are sealed due to ongoing criminal cases. So, for instance, my money is seized. I had nothing to do with what's going on. However, a deputy has sworn that he pulled me over and that I was connected to the Sinaloa cartel. And they can't tell the court or me through discovery how I'm connected to the Sinaloa cartel because I'm still under investigation for that crime that I'm never going to be charged for because I have no idea what the Sinaloa cartel is. But because of that, discovery can't be done and there is no transparency with the documents that I need to prove my innocence, because all I can do is go into court and say, I have no idea what the Sinaloa cartel is.
So that just leaves it wide open. Basically, they can do anything they want and say anything they want to, and then say it's not available for, reproach, basically.
Right, because it's an open and ongoing investigation,
and then you lose.
Right, I lose because I can't get the documents that I need to prove that
these people are actually... It violates the fundamental, it violates the foundation of our justice system, really. It does. It's not a criminal thing, but you having to go in there and prove your innocence is, it's wrong. Right. All of that's wrong.
And it's further convoluted because technically the state has seized a thing. They've seized money, they seized a car, they seized a house, they seized whatever. It's a thing. So the way that they get away with all of this in this flawed judicial process argument is that property, weirdly enough, does not have the same rights as a human. So my car that they seized during that thing where they said I was connected to the Sinaloa cartel, and the money they took from me where they said I was connected to the Sinaloa cartel, which I don't know what their connection that they're making is because they have an open and ongoing investigation that I'm not allowed to see. But the car and the money don't have the right to an attorney, and they don't have the right to the presumption of innocence. They just now belong to the state because the transfer occurred through civil asset forfeiture. Bizarre, right?
Right. And so Dateline says to the sheriff, this is, do you realize you're making money off of the war on drugs? And the sheriff said, well, yeah, there's money to be made. And then the correspondent said, well, do you see a problem with that? And I'm not even kidding you, did not blink an eye, said, well, no, there's no problem with that. That's the Jefferson Parish Sheriff saying that to Dateline. So it has not registered in his little pea brain that, because he doesn't even try to deny it or he doesn't feel the least bit embarrassed by what he's doing. It has not registered. You can tell. I don't know if it ever did, honestly, but it has not registered in that man's head what's happening. Even with because basically they all felt like they were blindsided by a national investigative news show, basically. But his reaction to that, just saying, I don't have a problem that we're making money off of the war on drugs. Why would I? It gives you a really good idea of what's happening there, because nobody should be making money off the war on drugs. It's a terrible thing that has, invaded lots of areas of our country. And it even if he feels like that, he shouldn't say that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, that sort of reiterates what you said. What you just said was pointed out in 1996. But it was pointed out in a different way. And that is the second flaw of civil asset forfeiture. It was pointed out by Justice John Paul Stevens during they were asked. The Supreme Court was ruling on the civil forfeiture of a house where marijuana had been illegally processed, and John Paul Stevens pointed out that this was an Eighth Amendment violation and an example of an excessive fine. But the rest of the Supreme Court disagreed with him because they didn't want to link law enforcement back to the war on drugs. But literally, this is them profiting off the sale of that house, the money going to the local law enforcement, and then being split up according to the jurisdiction, is literally everyone profiting off of the war on drugs. But the excessive fine is the idea that you can't fine someone to the extent that their life is over. This is related usually to criminal sentencing. So technically this would have been a violation of the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits the federal government from imposing excessive bail, excessive fines, or cruel and unusual punishments. So, but to tie back into exactly what you said, this is fascinating to me. The third stance of critics of civil asset forfeiture is that it motivates police misbehavior. The idea is that critics contend that the system, the way that it's set up currently, incentivizes what would be perverse behavior by anyone inclined to be a predatory government agency or a member of a predatory government agency. It makes it possible for government officials to seize property such as cash, vehicles, houses, and jewelry from people without convicting them for wrongdoing in a court or even charging them with a crime. The cash and the assets are a major temptation for police to presume that activity is illegal. Critics say the huge amount of money involved has a distorting effect on policing, such that police are more interested in seizing cash than actual illegal drugs. Seized assets can be used for police office expenses and new equipment, such as vehicles. The profit motive, in which police keep 90% or more of profits, forms the rotten core of forfeiture abuse. Prosecutors and police have a strong incentive to seize property since the funds can be used to pay the expenses of the district attorney's office, including salaries. Over a 10-year period, the forfeiture money collected was $25 million in Philadelphia, just Philadelphia. Seized funds were used to pay salaries for people working in the district attorney's office. When funds are returned to the victim, it can happen that funds come out of taxpayer money. Not out of the police funds, such as a pension fund or
So
some
see,
other
they don't
fund
even
related to
pay. They don't even pay.
Yeah, they don't even pay it back. So seized amounts of money have gone for new police equipment, parties, travel expenses, training seminars, sometimes held in distant locations with such strong law enforcement reputations as Las Vegas and Hawaii. A Texas prosecutor used $25,000 in seized cash to take his office staff, including their spouses, and a judge on a vacation to Hawaii. There are no penalties for wrongful seizures. So if it screws up,
The taxpayers pay for it.
yeah,
That's it.
taxpayers pay the ill-gotten gains from innocent citizens that must be returned. So there's an incentive to find a drug-related issue when police come across cash. The incentives work against policing and police seizing drugs, but push them to seize the cash instead. And there are references made in here. There's a quote from a guy named Jack Fishman, who was an IRS agent and a criminal defense attorney, and he made this in 2008. If a cop stops a car going north with a trunk full of cocaine, that makes for great press coverage and a great photo. Then they destroy the cocaine, which I'll come back to. If they catch him going south with a suitcase full of cash, the police department just got its budget for the year. So
I would say they got their budget either way.
Yeah, so there's 6 more things that they talk about, and then I'm gonna wrap up this episode and get your thoughts on this. So the critics talk about they talk about innocent owners being ensnared, and that it's difficult to challenge seizures. Those are the next 2. The third of the 6 is that the punishments are arbitrary because there's no system for like if you and I get pulled over, your car is worth one thing, my car is worth another thing. We can be pulled over for the same thing, and both of our cars can be seized, but there's an imbalance in the two things. And then whichever car is worth less could arguably worth more because of the fourth thing, which is this unfairly targets poor and politically weak persons. Meaning, if you're not connected, you can't get this stuff taken care of. The cost of hiring a lawyer for this type of case is $3,000 to $5,000. Just so people are aware of that fact. So if you're poor, $3,000 to $5,000 is a huge amount of money to suddenly come up with, and that is the average cost. Like there are some of these cases, the more that's involved, the more it's going to cost you. The fifth thing is that it subverts state laws. So local and state police often cooperate with federal authorities on what has been called equitable sharing agreements, since many states have laws restricting or limiting forfeitures, as well as having higher standards of proof. Local police sidestep these rules by treating the suspected criminal activity as a federal crime and bringing in the feds. That is disturbing in and of itself. But since most of this stuff takes place on a highway, you have an automatic nexus to federal cases. Just saying that it was, if you all you have to say is it's related to the highway. Accordingly, after a seizure, local and federal agencies share the proceeds, with 10 to 20% of it going to the federal agency. The remainder stays with the local police force. So accordingly, equitable sharing effectively subverts the will and intent of the state legislatures. So even if Louisiana really wanted to do something about this, they still have the problem of the federal side of this. So this has been criticized by prominent civil rights attorney and property
all
rights
that has to happen is the police don't abuse it. That's it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. This guy, the civil rights attorney and property rights advocate Scott Bullock, he says this is a violation of federalism. And that's like the idea that we don't have one government. We have multiple governments to keep everything checking and balancing itself.
Right. Well, they don't have to bring in the federal government. It's a choice that they make. Right.
It's a way around the law for police agencies. Now that would be more rare. Like you were talking about, like rareness in this. I think that would be a special kind of sheriff or police chief who has that edict issued in his office that, like, if we can't get it under state law, then you use the feds, because they're, different jurisdictions, like local, state, federal, you have different jurisdictional problems that come with that. And jurisdictions do not always play well together. And the last thing, the sixth thing here of these there's 9 total, but these are the last 6. This is the last of the 6. the extent
I
of
was
the
like,
abuse.
dang it, there's 6 more.
No. Proponents and critics differ about the extent of cases in which innocent persons have their property seized. So, proponents of civil asset forfeiture state that the cases are very few in number, and critics state that it's many in number where there's an instance of abuse. Basically, they're saying that the numbers, like both sides say that the numbers are in their favor. But the problem is when you get into situations where you're signing legal waivers and victims don't challenge seizures because they don't know how to challenge them for lack of knowledge or lack of ability to pay for a lawyer and other reasons related back to that lack of judicial transparency, which what I was saying was it's because people can't get things. People say it's an open and ongoing larger investigation, or it's become a federal investigation, or now it's a state investigation. You can't get the local documents you need. You can't you can't engage. So the abuse isn't really known overall, and they're not tracking like these instances currently. The Baltimore Sun said in 2012 that in the state of Maryland, specifically in Baltimore and Baltimore County, half of victims with seized assets were never convicted of a crime. That was their statement to all of this. And I want to go back to something I said a moment ago, and I swear I'm going to wrap up. And that's the Jack Fishman quote, because this comes into play with the Jeff Davis 8. He says, if a cop stops a car going north with a trunk full of cocaine that makes great press coverage, it makes great press coverage, it makes a great photo, then they destroy the cocaine. If they catch him going south with a suitcase full of cash, the police department just paid for its budget for the year. My suspicion of what was going on in Jennings, Louisiana relates back to this quote. Ethan Brown's suspicion of what was going on in Jennings, Louisiana relates back to this quote. My biggest problem with places like Jennings, Louisiana, is that they make arrangements to let the car with a trunk full of cocaine keep going north, and then they stop the person who gets the trunk full of cocaine. And when the car is going south, they stop the person with the trunk full of money, and they charge both of them, which wouldn't sound that unusual, except for what they do with the cocaine. According to Jack Fishman, if a cop stops a car going north with a trunk full of cocaine, that makes a great press coverage, makes a great photo, then they destroy the cocaine. And here is my problem with civil asset forfeiture in general. Whatever they're doing, they shouldn't be double dipping ever under any circumstances. But my opinion is that once an agency is caught selling drugs, they should not be allowed to participate in civil asset forfeiture without an independent citizen board review of their civil asset forfeitures.
That entire concept is so ridiculous to me that
What do you mean?
Well, that like a law enforcement agency caught selling drugs that they have seized would have to have some sort of culpability or some sort of auditing happening. Like, it's just, think about what you're saying there, or what's being...
I am totally aware. I am just trying to play within the system they've created.
I'm not saying anything about what you're saying. I'm saying the whole concept is so ridiculous.
Well, I mean, so this sort of wraps up the first episode about the Jeff Davis 8. It may not seem like this is about the Jeff Davis 8, but I'm just curious if you've done this yet. Have you tallied up the total number of murders and deaths that are suspicious in this case?
In this one case?
So related to Jeff Davis 8, and all the things that
I
surround the
don't
Jeff.
have a tally, no, but I've done pretty extensive research on it.
Yeah, and that's where I'm at. I'm pretty deep in research. So this is how I want to phrase this to wrap up this episode, and you can say whatever you want after that. Do you think it's just 8?
I don't even think it's 8 to begin with.
What do you mean?
Well, I think that the fact that there's 8 girls who have been killed and dumped in a small area where that typically doesn't happen bears no. That's the only reason we should refer to them as the Jeff Davis 8.
Yeah, it's almost.
I feel like they're all their own case.
See, that's where I'm getting at here. So the first part is admiring everything that people are trying to do to get this solved. I think it's confusing. I think it's kind of convoluted because this is like you and I sort of tend to go down 2 paths. One is like missing people. We like to know where missing people are over here, and we like to sort of weed out serial crimes related to that and serial killings. But typically in those instances, we're looking for 1 or 2 patterns and people in there. Like if we're chasing Ted Bundy, we know we're looking for a type of victim. If we're chasing Israel Keys, we're looking for a types of victims or whatever. In this case, the problem is I think this is presented as a serial killer case by law enforcement who are fully and completely aware that this is not a serial killer.
Do you think they really are? Really fully, completely aware of it? Because I'm not sure.
You think that this task force of multiple people believes that this is a serial killer?
I think that if they don't believe it, that it's like, I don't know that there's anything. I think that the biggest roadblock has been the fact that it's the Jeff Davis 8. Like the fact that like that's what it's referred to as and that's what it's seen as is like this one big thing. I think that is what's keeping it. It's keeping each case from being solved because it's really, I feel like there's connections between the cases, but like every single case is going to have its own resolution. And the fact that there's 8 unsolved murders in this area, and that's the Jeff Davis 8. Because if you don't know anything about the case, you assume that it's a serial killer. Like that's how it's on its face. It's presented, right?
I agree with you.
That's an assumption that's made. I don't necessarily think that law enforcement is doing that to skew anything. I feel like there are members of law enforcement who are, legitimately working the case. And it actually is really hard to say that, 8 unsolved murders of girls who lived the lifestyle these girls lived aren't, the work of a serial killer, except they're not the work of a serial killer. But I feel like it could be very easily overlooked because as far, they're lumped together and that's what's tripping it up.
Do you feel like I'm going to tell you an interesting observation I made, but I'm curious. Do you feel like boiling it down to a single Jeff Davis 8, like a moniker like that, do you feel like that's minimizing these women's lives?
Well, not necessarily, because like I said, there is an element of that statement that's true. There are 8 unsolved murders there. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So if you're referencing it that way, I don't know that it would be, making the victims, less important or anything like that. But I do feel like the stigma attached to how Jeff Davis 8 is interpreted on a wide scale, like if you just assume this is a series of murders that are all related, then yes, it does devalue them. And it does, because it keeps their cases open and it keeps their loved ones not knowing what really happened.
Well, what I found interesting was in the early media coverage of this versus the sort of the ongoing coverage. And I want to say like local press, that's not exactly true. I mean, there is some local press coverage of this case, but largely it's when it gets some, it's not even the national attention. It got national attention. It's the regional attention that it gets that made me pause, because there's a point in time where they aren't 8. They're sort of, they're a series of murders. And I think it starts getting coverage around 5, but it really gets coverage around 7. They're not called the Jeff Davis 8 then. And the observation I made was there's a task force. I think they called it an MAIT or something like. I don't remember the exact name of the task force. That comes up a little later on. But there's a task force and there's press coverage of this, but they never name the killer. It's always about the victims. That made me. I think the press and law enforcement very early on knew that this was not a single killer. They call it a possibly connected cases. They call it possible serial offender or common offender, but they never name it like the swamp monster or the swamp strangler.
They don't name the killer. I see what you're saying.
It's not the Jeff Davis strangler. It's not the swamp strangler. It's not the like Long Island serial killer or the Night Stalker or whatever. It's never about naming. Even in the press, it's never about naming a killer. It's always the Jeff Davis 8 or the Jennings 8 or the Jennings murders or the Jeff Davis murders.
Are there other groups of victims out there that are named?
Like in the world?
Well, just like in this case, the Jeff Davis 8 are 8 women in Louisiana in the Jeff Davis parish that were killed between 2005 and 2009, and their murders are unsolved. Is there another group you could tell me just right off the top of your head?
Well, I
can't think of any.
I can tell you a couple, but the thing about them is they changed. So there's the Snow murders, and the Snow murders was
the Snow Children.
They were called the Snow murders. Murders, Murders. It is the Snow Children, but they eventually gave him a name as the Oakland County child killer. Mm-hmm. So there's no name for this killer.
Well, that's because there's multiple killers. Right,
which is where...
In fact, it would be... The reason that comes into play is because it would be really hard typically to put a name such as the Jeff Davis 8 or the Jennings 8 or however you want to reference these girls. It's typically impossible to do that with a group of victims of a serial killer.
Yeah.
Like you couldn't do that.
That to me is also a giant tip off that it's not like, so I go back and forth on this because like you said, when you first get into this case, it's like, oh, there's a serial killer. And then it's more like, oh, they've got like a different kind of problem and it's just a bunch of murders. And then it's like, well, what if there's 2 or 3 serial killers? Like, I don't know if you found yourself doing this.
No, I haven't really found myself doing that, but I have found myself just really, because I always assumed that Jeff Davis 8 was the product of a serial killer. That was like not knowing anything about the case, right? Like not having looked at it really.
Right.
I always assumed that it was because that's how it comes across, and that's how just not thinking about it, it would be. But it's funny that you say that because there was this is kind of it's sort of crass, but it's funny, except that it has to do with girls that have died. But at one point, the sheriff erroneously says that, he doesn't know that they're dealing with a serial killer, that they may be just dealing with a serial dumper. Probably the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard anybody say.
Well, what did you think of that comment? What did you think it meant?
What he meant by that was that the same people were taking the girls and dumping them. Like the same while they may have overdosed in a hotel room and like they weren't murdered, that, the same group of people would then, dispose of the body. It's just, it was just bad wording, and he clearly made that term up because even, as a law enforcement official or, as podcasters, we're not going to use the term serial dumper to describe, a person who is not killing but disposing of bodies. Like, it's not nice. It really makes the victim seem disposable, which is exactly what we're not trying to do. We're trying to not do that.
Well, that explains why the press didn't latch on to the Jeff Davis dumper for the name of this killer, because that would be crass. It would be terrible. What? They don't name him. They know it's not a serial killer.
Not. They can't name him. They could name them.
And that's sort of where we're going with this. That's probably the name of this episode now, is them.
So my final thoughts on, I didn't realize we were going to talk so much about civil asset forfeiture, but it is an important element of this case. And it does give a really good idea from a sort of non-biased source of, you can see the clips from Dateline, and you see the sheriff that was in power for a lot of the time during these cases. And I would say this, we are very fortunate that it's not worse than it is. And that sucks, but at the same time, that line of power that's there, we are everybody, and I don't just mean, people in Louisiana, but people everywhere, we're fortunate that it's not worse than it is.
Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabRottiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabRottiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.